Welcome back to the Gamer Muscle YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to be comparing the HTC VIVE wand controllers with the Oculus Rift touch controllers and going through the good and bad points of each controller, and hopefully helping those of you that are sitting on the fence to decide which controllers and ultimately which headset is probably going to be best for you. Now, it's worth saying at the beginning of this video that there is not one clear winner here. Both controllers have some positives and some negatives, rather like the headsets on the market, in that they're first-gen devices, and I think there's still room for improvement in both cases. Now, beginning with the VIVE controllers, the VIVE wands, we'll talk about the good things first, and I think the best thing with these controllers is that they have the ginormous donut on top of them, which at first makes them look somewhat absurd and potentially more than capable at holding a small cup of tea or perhaps a shot of vodka. But the advantage of having these ginormous Tauruses on top of the controllers means that they pretty much never lose tracking. And compared to the Rift controllers, even if you're just using a single lighthouse, and even if you're dancing around like a baboon that's just escaped a zoo, you're going to have solid millimeter perfect tracking. So that is probably the best aspect of the VIVE controllers. Now, another aspect of the VIVE controllers that I really like is that, though I guess for some people it might be a complaint, they are reasonably hefty and feel quite snug in your hands, and they really do give the impression that you're gripping onto and actually holding something significant. They feel like you've actually got something in your hand. Now, this works really well with VR titles where you're, say, holding a gun or you're holding a specific tool in virtual reality. It gives you a reasonably good sense of presence to the fact that you're actually holding onto something that's there in your hand and you're gripping onto it. And they've also then put the grip button at the bottom that you will tend to squeeze. If you're squeezing the controller, you will then squeeze the grip button, and it all just feels very natural and really does convey the sense that you're both holding something in reality and virtual reality, confusing your brain into making you think that, you know, what you're holding onto is something tangible. Another really nice thing with the VIVE wand controllers is that the haptic motor, or rather it essentially uses a speaker-like system, a magnetic actuator, I guess, on the touchpad. That motor and rumble is surprisingly strong, and when developers take advantage of it and use it properly, not only do you get reasonably firm jolts. Let's face it, it's not going to be like firing a gun or a rifle, but when you get reasonably firm jolts from it, you get a nice sense of vibration, which again adds to the immersion of the game. But another advantage of this sort of sound-based actuated, magnetic actuated haptic feedback is that it has the potential to be quite high fidelity and has an almost infinite amount of haptic options and types of vibrations, and could even in some cases be used as a speaker. Those of you that use a Steam controller or have been looking around the internet will have seen people actually make music using the Steam controller. Something I wouldn't advise, and is a completely useless thing to do with the controller, but it does at least show you the potential for the resolution and depth of the haptic feedback possible from this touchpad. Now, the rest of the buttons on the controller, you've got the trigger on the bottom, which has a... Let's try and get the light on that. Good. It has a pull down and then a click. So it's a very positive action for you to know that you've fully depressed it and then clicked it. Now, there's been a little bit of debate online as to why developers don't use the click at the bottom of the trigger when you pull it all the way down as a secondary button action, and it turns out that apparently that click might not actually be mapped to a button or isn't exposed in the SDK, so developers can't actually use that click as a button. But regardless of whether or not it's used as a button, at least it means when you're playing a game, you know as an end user that you've pulled the analog stick all the way down and you are actually engaged in a click, and you've fully actuated the pull of the analog trigger. Now, it is worth saying though, the analog trigger doesn't have that much travel to it before it clicks. So for first-person shooters, that's quite nice because you don't normally need that much pull, or you don't want a lot of analog pull to actuate something. But when it comes to if you want more precise control of a hand, and often this button is mapped so that when it's pulled down it pulls in a hand, there's not much travel there for it to be mapped to an in-game hand, so it's harder for developers to have a one-to-one control, but it works enough. It is an analog input and it does work to a basic level, and there's enough there for it to give a bit of hand presence in virtual reality. Lastly, the other buttons, you've got the Steam menu button at the bottom, and then you've got a game menu button at the top, and those buttons work perfectly fine. They're nicely spaced. Some people complain that they accidentally push the bottom button when they're using the D-pad, but personally I've not found that to be an issue myself. And there is one other button in that the touchpad itself can also be pushed down. Also, both controllers are exactly the same. They can be used in either hand, upside down, inside out, it doesn't matter, they're identical. With that said, those were the good points of the Steam or the Vive controller, the Vive version of the Steam controller. Those were the good points of the Vive Steam controller. Now onto the bad points of the Vive Steam controller. I think the first bad point with these is that the touchpads, although really good in the sense that developers can choose how they want to use the touchpad, and it's really versatile, and also users can have the ability to set it up with lots of options, as again we found with the Steam controller. It can either be used as different button sections or be used for swiping, and there's a lot of input options there. One thing the touchpad is pretty terrible for is when it comes to using it as an analog stick. Touchpads just don't make good analog sticks. It's very hard to know where your thumb is on the touchpad, and you find when you swipe your thumb will just move around a bit, especially when you're holding onto the controller like this, and it's quite hard to do up and down motions and fully use it. It just doesn't make a good analog stick. So games where you might have a mixture of a classic game, so say you're playing a new retro arcade and you want to use a more analog input with one of the emulators on there, or what we've seen quite a lot of recently are shooters that introduce artificial locomotion, such as Pavlov, and even Onward to some extent, though Onward actually uses the pointing direction of the controller to choose where you want to go. What you find is that the touchpad often doesn't move you where you expect it to move unless you're concentrating or you're very practiced with it. Compared to if you're using an analog stick on a controller, it's just incredibly intuitive, and you have the feedback of the analog stick on the controller, on the analog joystick, to know exactly where you're pushing it, how much you're pushing it to, and it's also a lot easier with an analog stick to quickly move left and right very precisely. So I think that probably is the worst aspect of the Vive controllers, just the lack of an analog stick. Now, I think you could argue that Valve have done that because it's virtual reality, and maybe developers should take advantage more of the fact that the whole controller is tracked, and maybe they were expecting people to use more things like teleportation, or, as I say, onwards movement system where you sort of aim with the controller and then just use this to move up and down. But even again with onwards, sometimes it's hard to activate the jogging relative to the walking, and sometimes in other games it's hard to be precise in terms of knowing exactly if your thumb's close or if you're moving it far away or then moving it in different directions. So it's just one of those things where I think with practice you can kind of get used to it, but personally I prefer in general to have, or would prefer to have, an analog stick, or maybe as a worst case compromise, what Valve could have done is put some little bumps on these controllers. You'll notice even with the Steam controller that there's actually, on the left hand Steam controller, there's actually an indentation that lets you see exactly where your thumb is. It lets you feel where your thumb is. There isn't one on the right hand side. So again, even on the Steam controller, it'd be nice to have just little bumps or something to let you know where your thumb is. Other than that though, I'd say these are pretty fantastic controllers, and it's very rare that you feel like you're not in control of your game, or that they're losing tracking, or that they've got a problem. They are perhaps the most solid, in fact, well, not even perhaps, they are the most solidly tracked or the best tracked virtual reality controllers that you can currently get at this point in time for virtual reality when it comes to raw precision of tracking. Also, I forgot to mention, there is the nice feature that they have a lithium battery inside of them, and the battery has about 2 to 3 hours of battery life of continued use, if not more. And you just plug it into a USB port to charge it, and you can forget it, and you're done there with the charging. So just really nice controllers. I actually think HTC and Valve pretty much nailed it and hit the ball out of the park with these controllers. Congratulations, well done HTC, well done Valve, and I'm excited to see the future revisions and changes to these controllers as new VR headsets come out using the OpenVR platform. As we know, Valve like to iterate on things, and I'm sure controllers will be one of the things they iterate on quite considerably. Okay, let's move on to the Oculus Rift controllers. First, we will look at the buttons and talk about the good points. Now, the most obvious and striking aspect of the Oculus Rift controllers is that the first time you pick them up, they sort of just flop into your hand, and they fit in and just feel very natural. It's almost as if you were to take a block of butter out of a fridge and squeeze it a little bit, stop it from melting fully, and then you would have something that just fits nicely in your hand. Though with the block of butter, it would be very sticky and probably not a good situation. But these controllers, they just feel absolutely fantastic when you first grab onto them. You also find that you have this, the grip button on the bottom is there and ready and nicely placed at the side, and very different to any other grip button that I've ever seen on any other controller ever made in the history of controllers. What's nice is the grip button, unlike the Steam controller, is also an analog button. Along with the front, the sort of trigger button at the front. So you get a good analog potential for either gripping in games and it representing the hand in game, or anything that a developer decides to use that gives analog input. Now, the travel of that grip button, so it's not a ginormous amount of travel, but it's fairly generous. It's pretty much on par with like an Xbox 360 controller's travel, and the actual pressure required to actuate it is really light, so you're not having to squeeze it particularly hard. Conversely, the button on the Vive controllers requires a reasonable amount of pressure to squeeze it. Moving on to the touch controller's trigger, it's fairly similar to what's found on the Vive controller in terms of the actual distance of travel. It doesn't have massive amounts of travel to it. I'd say around about a centimetre or so of travel, but it does the job. Again, it's an analog input, so it can be mapped to hands or pointing or anything that needs to be moved. You don't feel like you haven't got precise control with it, so it does the job as an analog input. But also, because it's not a ridiculous amount of travel on the trigger, when it comes to playing shooting games, it's not it doesn't require too much effort to actuate a pistol and do firing with it. And in many ways, I find this trigger a little bit more satisfying to shoot with than I do the Vive controller. You also notice on the actual trigger, they've done a really nice job, and this is one of the things they've again, it's to do with like the sort of shaping of the controller. They've beveled the front of it in two different angles, so you can hit it or squeeze it with just the under part of your thumb, or you can actually squeeze it with the end of your finger, and it allows you to be squeezing the controller at many different angles, putting your fingers in different places to get different amounts of precision of input from it. And it just feels really comfortable, and it feels like you've got something there to say you're holding it like and you're squeezing it from here. You can then just feel like you've always got a grip on the trigger to be able to squeeze it. And I think what it will do is it accommodates different people that have different size hands, or have different amounts of mobility to their fingers. So it's just a really nice, sleek design. Also, we're saying, again, with the grip button that we talked about a second ago, that has a really nice shaped finish to it and is really nicely beveled. It's sharp at the edges but beveled on the center, so your finger just falls right into it and it just melts into your hand, and that's what they've done absolutely fantastically with this controller. Now, when it comes to the buttons on the top of the controller, you've got a Y, X, and a B and an A button, and you'll notice it takes a very similar format to what you have with classic game controllers. And the clear advantage with this is that if you go and play a non-touch based game, you can still use these touch controllers with it. And if you're going to play any game, like say you're going to play an emulated game on New Retro Arcade, you have these analog sticks that allow you to approach them as you would want to play them normally without the issues that you get with the Vive touchpad. The analog sticks as well, both feel really nice. They don't have that much travel to them. They're quite loose. They're not the stiffest of analog sticks, but they feel pretty much on a par with what you'd expect from something like an Xbox 360 controller, or a PlayStation controller. They do have that sort of fuzzy grip finish on the edge of the analog sticks as well, so your thumb's not going to slide around, with it soft on the middle. So again, when you're not looking at them, you know exactly where your thumb is. You've got good feel for the position of the joystick, and it's very easy to move them around. And again, just be very confident with what you're doing with the input of them. They also have a downwards push, which is commonplace with any analog stick. It's the norm now, the downward push. It's there on everything, but it's an extra button, and just works as you would expect. Now, aside from the normal buttons that extrude out exactly the same as an Xbox 360 controller, you also have the flat buttons, which are obviously not extruded, so they're a lot harder to accidentally push. But one of them brings up stuff like menus in games, and the other one brings up the Oculus panel, which lets you change things like volume, see which friends are online, and adjust your Oculus chaperone settings. You can also use the menu button in OpenVR to bring up the Steam overlay if you happen to be using your Oculus Rift with OpenVR instead of Oculus games. There's the additional feature though with these, which you can't really demonstrate in this video, but the feature is most of the buttons have a capacitance detection on them, so when it comes to playing games that have hand gesture controls or that they fully use the Oculus SDK, the in-game avatar knows, or the hands in-game know where your thumbs are resting on the controller, so the game will mirror your precise gestures of your hand. So if you happen to take your finger off the trigger, your in-game hands will match exactly with your real-world hands. If you take your hands off those buttons, your avatar will be doing exactly the same as you are doing in reality, but in virtual reality. And really, that's clearly been the objective, and the objective that I think they've executed extremely well with the touch controllers is that rather than feeling as if you're holding onto a tool, these controllers essentially act as a conduit to put your hands into virtual reality as best possible with actual buttons and utility that you'd get from a controller, compared to something like Leap Motion that also tracks your hands and allows your hands to be put into virtual reality. But the problem with stuff like Leap Motion is that you don't get the advantage of actual tactile buttons that give a positive response as to if you're pushing them or not. But also, the Leap Motion has the issue of not actually being 100% precise at all times, whereas these are basically the best and most detailed way of getting your hands fully tracked in virtual reality, at least for a consumer at this point in time. Now, I think that covers pretty much all the good points. It's now time to move on to the bad points with these controllers. And I think the first really bad point is that though the tracking has improved greatly as Oculus keep updating their software, fundamentally the Oculus tracking just isn't as precise or as good at avoiding occlusion as the Vive tracking. Now, it's hard to know how much of the tracking is down to the optical tracking that Oculus decided to use versus Vive's Lighthouse system, or the actual controller design and how good the controller is at being exposed to whatever tracking method they're using. Now, I have seen that the controller tracking has improved gradually with the software, and I think the more cameras you add to your setup with the Oculus solution, the better the tracking gets. But that said, I do think these controllers themselves are slightly more prone to becoming occluded than the ginormous donut Vive controllers, just because they're more sleek. The the ring is going around your hand, and it's just more likely that when you bring these into your body, or if you are like an escaped baboon from the zoo, as I say, they're just less likely to be detected or seen or picked up by any sensor. So I think the tracking is slightly worse with these controllers than the Vive ones. That said, I would say the difference between the tracking is the Vive ones are basically 99.9% perfect. These are sort of 98.9% perfect. Obviously, for game controllers, you don't want the controller to ever stop functioning, so you really want it to be 100%. But the point is, these are both first-gen devices, and for the most part, tracking is not a problem with either, and it's actually quite incredible how well both controllers work. But the Vive controllers do that aspect slightly better. Now, another negative for me, and I know this isn't going to be a negative for everyone, is that the controller uses a single AA battery to power it. Or one controller has one battery and the other controller has one battery. And this adds a bit of extra weight to the controller. It's not the end of the world because the controller is still well balanced, but personally I'd just prefer it if it was slightly lighter, or just have the lithium battery so I can plug it in and charge it whenever I finish my VR session and come back to it with them fully charged like I do with the Vive controllers. In terms of battery life, though, it's absolutely fantastic. I've got the same batteries in that I've been using for the past 2 months, or when I first got a hold of these, and have not had any issues with them. So, I guess it's a subjective issue. I prefer lithium batteries, but the AA battery that it does have is perfectly fine. Separate to that, there is the issue of the rumble motor. And for whatever reason, the rumble doesn't seem to give a similar haptic feel to what you'd expect from something like an Xbox 360 controller, and mine makes quite an audible buzzing sound when I use it, which sounds like a 1960s Del Boy van pooping you as it drives down the road. I don't know why. I've asked other people, they say their buzzing is fairly similar with their controllers. It would have been nice, given that these are essentially taking aspects of an Xbox type controller and then adding motion control and building on that and doing a really fantastic VR input device. It would have been good to have the same haptic vibrations and haptic depth that you also find in an Xbox controller. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but the result is the buzzing and haptic feedback is not as good as what you get with the Vive controller, and it does tell you what's going on in the game, it does respond to a game, but it's just not as nice as I think it could be. So the haptic feedback, again, I think is a bit of a down point with these controllers. So all in all, with the Oculus Touch controllers, again, just like Valve, I think Oculus have pretty much hit the ball out of the park here. They go for a different approach than the Vive controllers in that they make your hands feel as if your hands are in the game, rather than you feeling as if you're holding onto a tool. The presence you get from the Oculus Rift controllers are the fact that your hand gestures are represented in the game from the use of these controllers, and you do get really good hand presence from the close proximity that you can use them. Unfortunately, when it comes to picking a favourite between the Oculus controllers and the Vive ones, you end up with the same really annoying situation that you have with the head-mounted displays, in that both controllers are really quite good, but both controllers lack something that the other one has. In the case of the Vive controllers, it lacks the utility and practicality that you get from having the analog stick and more traditional game buttons. In the case of the touch controllers, it lacks the almost infallible, near perfect occlusion resistance that the Vive ones have. In the case of the touch controllers, you get really nice gesture recognition, with your hands in reality being mirrored pretty much one-to-one in virtual reality. However, with the Vive ones, you get the feeling that you're actually holding on to something that's in virtual reality, and it feels as if you're actually holding that gun or actually holding that tool, with it having a little bit of mass and a little bit of sturdy feel to it. Ultimately, whichever one you buy, you're either going to be really happy or really disappointed, and if you happen to own both, you're always going to be irritated by one lacking what the other one has, or vice versa. So that pretty much covers, as in depth as I can possibly fathom, the differences between the HTC VIVE controllers and the Oculus Rift touch controllers. I think both companies did an absolutely incredible job. It's Gen 1 of virtual reality, and just following on this week from GDC, virtual reality is here to stay. It's accelerating faster than an out-of-control caravan down a mountainside, and that is only good news for everyone that is stuck in the 1990s, such as myself. If you enjoyed this video though, don't forget to click the subscribe button, don't forget to like it, and check out our other virtual reality videos that we have on the channel. The buttons are going to be on the screen somewhere for you to click. I'll see you in the next one we do. It'll be up very soon indeed. Goodbye everybody.